Okay, so here we are, another week, another topic, same me. I thought about changing my shirt just to sort of change things up, but it's fine. It is what it is. Today, so I don't have a lot of slides for today, in part because this week is a really reading heavy week for you. So I really hope you didn't wait until about 11 o'clock on Monday night to watch this, knowing that class is at 10 o'clock on Tuesday, because otherwise you're going to have a lot of late night, not so exciting reading to be doing. And that's part of why I've separated this. So in the past, like when we've held live traditional classes, I've had this lecture, like this ethics part, sort of tagged on to the ends of chapter 4 and 16, but then 2 weeks for it. Anyway, point being, we never ever got to it, but I made everybody do the reading ahead of time, and then nobody ever did it, so then they had an extra week to do it. What you are going to want to do before class tomorrow, assuming that you're watching this the night before, if you are smartly giving yourself more time, that is smart. We have the APA Ethics Code, or the Ethical Principles of Psychologists and Code of Conduct. It's not that big, but it's very dense. And then we also have the Canadian Code of Ethics for Psychologists, which is considerably longer, but is written a little bit more like something you'd be more prepared to read. Please make sure you have read these before class, because we will be talking about them. You can even see I've already started post-it noting up the codes to indicate things that I want to talk about with you. So it is your responsibility to have those read. Again, they are on Blackboard. There's links to them, or you could also just Google, quite frankly, the APA and CPA ethics codes, and they will come up as full documents. So the reason we're taking a full week to talk about ethics, and you might be thinking, like, really, Carrie, ethics again? Like, haven't we already covered this and research methods and all these other things? And yeah, you have. But again, we're going to go in a bit of a different direction. I think what you're going to find throughout this course is we're going to hit up on some topics that you're like, I already know about that. But we're going to attack it from a different angle, and so hopefully you will get some value added from it. The reason we're talking about ethics is because of how important ethics are in the world of abnormal and clinical psychology, and how utterly critical it is that we as psychologists, for you guys as psychology students, and hopefully, or maybe, I shouldn't say hopefully, maybe one day psychology trainees, are working in any way with people in any sort of human service or social service capacity, is that we really have to be mindful of ethics and things that we don't always necessarily think about, we maybe sometimes have to think about. And so I want to sort of get us to why we're where we are today. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take a little bit of a trip back in time, and we're going to look at why we need ethical principles, why we need those two not so exciting documents that I have posted on Blackboard for you to read. So history has taught us that we need to be ethical. This is not necessarily the most popular opinion of mine, but I'll share it with you anyway. Inherently, people suck. Let's just go with that. And I think in some ways, what we're currently living through with the COVID-19 pandemic is we are seeing that. Like, people had a chance back in March and April. A lot of people, not all people. I want to add a caveat. There are absolutely people, and some of you are these people who needed to be working and needed to be outside of the house. You are essential workers, or you have family members who are essential workers, and I cannot thank you enough for taking the chances you took with your life and your health to make sure the rest of us were able to safely shelter in place. But if more of us who were able to shelter in place had stayed in place, if more of us had followed all of the public health guidelines, we might actually not be in the situation we're in right now. And so I go back to inherently, people kind of suck. I think, and I don't think it's intentional. I don't think we deliberately try to be not so great, but I think if we were to have no laws and no rules and no morals and no ethics, Lord only knows what things would look like out there, right? So There's a reason behind it. And I know that as you read, if you already read the ethics codes, or as you're going to read the ethics codes, you're going to be like, I can't believe they have to put that in black and white. I can't believe that they have to actually spell that out for people. Yeah, they do, because people suck, okay? And we're going to take a look at how people have sucked throughout history and why it is that we now have the ethics codes that we have. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about the medical studies of the Second World War. Now, again, you will see that I go to only the finest academic websites. Your link here is to Wikipedia. And what I will say to you what I say to every class whenever I bring up a wiki link. Wikipedia is a good starting point. Wikipedia should never be your ending point, okay? But Wikipedia is a good place to go to get some information. You cannot fully trust the information, but to get some idea of what's going on. The other nice thing about Wikipedia is if you actually ever make it all the way to the bottom of a page, is that's where the references are, and that will actually take you to some better sources. But rather than doing a Google search and getting all sorts of questionable hits, start at Wiki and then look at some of those references, okay? And I will tell you off the bat, in terms of for information about these medical studies from the Second World War, the United States Holocaust Museum is an excellent, excellent resource. They have great information. I actually have a book from the museum that I used to sometimes bring into class with me to actually read part of it, part of their documentation about these medical studies. But the basic gist of it was World War II happened from 1939 to 1945. So you're thinking like, well, that's a long time ago. And it kind of was, but it also was kind of less than 100 years ago. So in the giant scheme of things, not that long ago, right? And of course it was wartime, but that shouldn't mean that like we have to become absolutely abysmal, awful, terrible people. Some people were, other people definitely were not. But one of the things that happened was there was a doctor whose name was Dr. Joseph Mengele, and he was like the lead doctor at Auschwitz, and he would select people, prisoners, for his medical studies. And I say studies like that because it's unclear even today what the point of many of his studies were and how that knowledge would have changed anything. Typically, as you might recall from our chapter on research methods, so now it's making sense why we did that first, we need to have a hypothesis, we should be able to predict what will happen, there should be a purpose to the study. And a lot of Mengele's studies had no purpose. It almost seemed like the purpose was to see how much harm he can inflict and how much pain he could inflict on people to lead them to their breaking point, because that's what a lot of them seemed like. So some examples of things that he did, and again, this is a medical doctor. This is somebody who has medical training and who has sworn an oath to do no harm. But he was really fascinated by conjoined twins, which at the time were known as Siamese twins. Now the proper terminology is conjoined twins, so twins who did not fully in the gestational period split apart, so they are conjoined at some part of their body. There are some that have been conjoined, like they share a brain, so they're together at the head, hip, sharing internal organs. He was fascinated by conjoined twins. But of course they're quite rare. So instead, he would take regular sets of twins and sew them together. Please tell me, I don't think you can, because I've been asking this question for years and I've been thinking about it for years. How does taking two fully formed individuals and sewing them together mimic what conjoined twins would experience, when conjoined twins are often sharing major organs or sharing like a leg? And that was basically just his own special little pet project. And so in that book from the US Holocaust Museum, there's a quote from the story of a mother of twins who he sewed together, who then, where the sutures were got so infected that the kids were in agony and were sick, and she got someone to steal morphine, and she essentially overdosed her own children to put them out of their misery because he had sewn them together. Yeah. Another one of the experiments, and again, you'll read about other awful things, but another one which ostensibly the purpose was to figure out how long they would have to rescue a downed fighter pilot. So of course, the war didn't take a break because it was winter, and they were curious when a Nazi pilot, if his plane was shot down or if he had to eject from his plane, how long they would have to find him in the forest before he would die. Which again, that sounds like, okay, legitimate actual outcome for this study. But how did they do the study? They took prisoners the prisoners were emaciated because they were fed like hardly anything, certainly not enough calories to thrive on, only enough to barely survive. The prisoners also didn't have proper clothing or uniforms. They basically had like a canvas shirt and pair of pants. Some didn't even have shoes. And most were unwell on some level because of the conditions they were living under. But they would take this prisoner, as opposed to a Nazi fighter pilot who's been eating well, has a flight suit, has a warm jacket, right? So let's just take those two pieces and say we're not starting from the same square. And they would deliberately freeze, like pour water over the person, because imagine also that the pilot lands in a lake or a marsh or it's raining, right? And then leave the person outside in the cold to see how long it took for them to die. Medical doctor doing that level of experiments. History has taught us that we need to be ethical, right? People, when left to their own devices, when given carte blanche to do whatever they want, don't always choose the right, nice thing. So you also might be thinking, okay, Carrie, yeah, okay, that's horrible and that's awful, but that's medical, right? What does that really have to do with psychology? Well, that's a bit of a fair question, but we'll get there. So just hold on to that question, put it in your back pocket, and we'll get there. You might also be thinking, but that was in Europe. That was a different place, that was a different time, that would never happen here. Exhibit B, Tuskegee. So some of you may know the term Tuskegee. You may have heard about them. There's two things that Tuskegee is really famous for. The Tuskegee Airmen, who were a group of black pilots in the Army at a time when, of course, there was tremendous racial segregation in the United States, but the Tuskegee Airmen were a really great group of pilots in the Army, but they were a completely segregated unit from white people. That's not what we're talking about, although we could on so many other levels. But the other thing Tuskegee is known for is the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. I have talked about this so many times and I still have trouble getting the words out because this was a research project that, much like a lot of Mengelé's experiments, had no actual clear outcome and nothing to possibly gain from it. What is most abhorring about this is that the study went on from 1932 to 1972, 40 years. It was the United States Public Health Service that was studying, or said they were doing an experiment on 399 black men in the late stages of syphilis. They essentially wanted to see the difference in how late-stage syphilis affected black men as compared to white men. First fatal flaw, there were no white men in the study. How can you compare the effects on people who are white and black if you only have black people? Yeah, I'm scratching my head still over that one, like that you can't. Their theory was that white people would have more cardiovascular problems and that black people would be left with more mental issues. I believe, yes. Oh, sorry. No, whites more neurological, blacks more cardiovascular. But the question becomes, first of all, how can you do that with only black people in the study? And number two, how would that change anything? Right? We're looking at what effect it has on your body, not a potential treatment, not some sort of prevention, but just How would that knowledge change anything? These men in the study were essentially told they were being treated for bad blood. And at the time, in 1932, in all fairness, there was no cure for syphilis, there was no treatment for syphilis. They basically were able to treat symptoms, and that was about it. But, there's always a but. In the 1940s, penicillin was discovered. You know what the treatment, the gold standard treatment for syphilis is today? If you said penicillin, you are correct. So a treatment was developed that could actually get rid of the syphilis and also then lead these men to not go on and infect their wives, their partners, their children, because some of their children were born with congenital syphilis, and it was withheld from them. When some of these men signed up to join the army, they were exempted from army service so as to not be given penicillin to cure their syphilis. That's how deep this was within the public health service for a study that had zero merits. So again, I say to you, history has taught us that we need to be ethical. Okay? So again, the link here will take you over to Wikipedia, which is a good starting point to learn more, but then you can delve deeper if you choose to. Okay, just when we haven't been far enough down the rabbit hole, because now you're still thinking, okay, yes, that was North America, but A, it was the United States, and it was the southern United States, right? It was Alabama. B, medical. Now, the reason this starts tying into psychology is because in late stages of syphilis, people can actually become psychotic. That is one of the known things. And that is one of the reasons that we want to treat people before they reach the late stages of syphilis, okay? So this is also where I usually do a public service announcement. If you haven't been tested before, if you haven't always practiced safer sexual practices, you might want to go ahead and get yourself tested because the vast majority of sexually transmitted infections can be cleared up with a course of antibiotics. Just saying. What else do you have going on right now? We're still under partial lockdown. I mean, really, just go get tested. No biggie. Okay, so this takes us to Milgram. And now you're going, oh, him again. We've heard about him before. Of course you have. But we're going to talk about Milgram from an ethics standpoint a little bit more than anything. And this is, again, where I said things will go full circle. Milgram got interested in setting up his obedience studies as a result of the Second World War. Part of what happened after the war, a number of Nazis were put on trial at what was known as the Nuremberg trials, because it was held in the city of Nuremberg in Germany. And person after person got up on the stand and said, I was only following orders, right? So basically everyone who wasn't Hitler, Eichmann, Mengele, the people up at the top, just said, I was just following orders. I was just following orders. And Milgram, back in the lab in Connecticut at Yale University, said, what? You know, it's one thing when someone's holding a gun to your head saying you need to shoot the person standing in front of you and you know that if you don't, they will fire their gun and kill you. It's another thing to treat people horrendously for years on end and go, well, I was just following orders, right? If my department chair told me that I was supposed to, at the end of today's video, give you a pop quiz worth 75% of your course grade, do you think I would do it? Stay tuned and find out, right? I wouldn't, because and she wouldn't either. But again, right, I would say no. But what if she made a smaller ask of me? Something that I thought was maybe not so okay, but it's also, well, it's my chair asking me to do it. Maybe I should do it, right? That's what Milgram was trying to figure out. Do we just blindly follow authority? And what sort of authority, right? My department chair or my dean asks me to do something, and if I don't do it, I could lose my job. That's a very different consequence than, you know, some random person on the street asking me to do something where there's no consequence, okay? And so we all know that Milgram set up the paradigm with the learner, And the teacher, and of course the learner was always a Confederate, but the teacher didn't know that. And as the learner started making mistakes or not answering questions, the teacher was supposed to deliver an electric shock of increasing severity. The learner, of course, at times said, "Stop, stop, let me out." And the teacher was reminded by the experimenter that the experiment requires that you continue. So Milgram used very simple prompts. There was no force involved. If anybody stood up to leave, they wouldn't have been stopped. But of course, and what Milgram found is the vast majority of people continued delivering shocks. So obedient, because someone with supposed authority was telling them to do something. And this study has long been criticized as ethically challenged. Now, it got through an ethics board at the time. This was in the 60s. The same study in the same way would not make it through an ethics board today, but there have been replications with alterations that have happened in the last 10, 15 years. And one of the things that I want us to talk about during discussion is, was it ethical? Was it unethical? He did debrief participants. He did get informed consent. But some of them were led to believe that they killed someone by shocking them so much. Right? Is it? Isn't it? That's kind of the question. And so here's your first reflection question. And this one has a little bit of a background story to it. Some of you may be familiar with the book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. You may not be. It's a fabulous read. There's also, I think it might be on Crave, there's like a mini series or a biopic or something. I thought it was on Prime, but I checked Prime last night and it wasn't, so I'm thinking it was Crave, but I don't really remember. There's too many streaming services these days. But anyway, the book is great. The book is always better than the movie, by the way. Always. So read the book. But anyway, Henrietta Lacks is another person who was treated questionably by the medical system in the United States. It will come as no surprise that she was Black. Her cervical cancer cells are the source of the HeLa cells that have been indispensable to medical research. So her cells were found to replicate very quickly, and so those cells have been used in countless biomedical research experiments over the years. They were taken during a biopsy and used, though, without her consent. So when you have a medical procedure done, if you have a biopsy, if you're having surgery to remove something, today you'll be consented and asked if the doctors can dispose of it as waste or use it for research or experimentation if deemed fit. She was not asked that, so she had every reason to believe that her cells were being taken for biopsy and that was the only purpose. So given that these cells could be classified as medical waste, could the doctor justify reproducing them in the lab without Henrietta Lacks' consent? Is it ethical to do so? So that's a big thinking question for you. So you're probably going to want to go ahead and pause this at this point and really think about your answer. Maybe you're going to Google search Henrietta Lacks. Maybe you're going to read, you can go to Wikipedia. I did that last night too, okay? But really think about this. Is it ethical? Medical waste? The HeLa line of cells are still being used today in 2020 in research. They've been used worldwide. And if you think the amount of compensation her family got was $0, you're correct. That may have changed since the publication of the book, but up to that, basically they got nothing. Okay, so that's the historical perspective on ethics. The next place we're going, now that you're back, is thinking about the Canadian Psychological Association versus the American Psychological Association Code of Ethics, okay? So each CPA and APA put out an ethics code. I'm gonna sort of highlight here, I'm just gonna throw it all up at once. The main guiding principles. Now the Canadian Psychological Association, they say that their guiding principles are actually in order. So the most important thing is respect for the dignity of persons. And the way they explain it is, if you're ever in an ethical dilemma where you cannot ensure all 4 aspects, you would sacrifice responsibility to society in order to respect the dignity of persons, right? We still want to have that responsibility to society, but not at the expense of the dignity of a person. Responsible caring, integrity in relationships, and then finally that responsibility to society. So that's, when we have an ethical dilemma, that's sort of the order we go down. Utmost importance is respect for the dignity of persons. The American Psychological Association says that their guiding principles are not, they're just in alphabetical order, they are all of equal importance. As you can also see just from the way the language is used, the American one goes perhaps a little more legalese. Beneficence and non-maleficence, basically do good, do no harm. Fidelity and responsibility. Integrity, justice, and respect for people's rights and dignity. Those are the overarching things that we need to be thinking about when we think about ethics and treating people ethically. And so as you read both codes, you'll see that they give information for research participants, for therapy clients, just for people in general, for how psychologists handle conflict, right? All this stuff. So that's pretty much where I want you to go next, is to read these, read the CPA code, read the APA code, and then think about answering the following reflection questions. And after these reflection questions, that is actually the end of this video. This is a much shorter one because we have much more to talk about in class and because there's so much reading for you to do, both the links for the examples and then of course the APA and CPA ethics codes. So, 2 questions here. Reflection question number 2, which of these ethics codes, APA or CPA, do you think I am required to uphold? So me, Carrie Scherzer, PhD, your professor here at Mount Royal University. As I would have said on the first day of class, but again, I recognize that some of you may have added during add drop, missed the first day, which was live, not recorded. So first day of class, I shared with you that I am both licensed as a psychologist in New York State and registered as a psychologist in Alberta. I came to MRU from a college in upstate New York where I taught psychology at a liberal arts college, but I also had a private practice and I was also a psychologist at a drug and alcohol rehabilitation facility for adolescents. Prior to that work, almost all of my clinical work, not almost all of my clinical work was at university counseling centers. That's where I did pretty much all of my practica and internships throughout graduate school. I did some assessment inpatient, but the bulk majority of my therapy has been with university-age students. So, knowing that, I am a licensed psychologist in New York, and I'm a registered psychologist in Alberta, and I teach at MRU here in Calgary in Canada. Which ethics code am I required to uphold? And then which of these ethics codes are you, as a psychology student, required to uphold? So I look forward to reading your answers to that, and I look forward to what will hopefully be a very good discussion all about ethics.